Hello, I'm Paul McDonnell, and you're welcome to Focus on the Digital Markets Act. This is the second of a series of short podcasts in which I interview experts about the impact of Europe's forthcoming Digital Markets Act, or DMA. I'm delighted to be joined today from London by Kay Jebelli, Competition and Regulatory Counsel at the Computer and Communications Industry Association, CCIA. Kay is normally based in Brussels, but he's just in London at the moment. Kay is a lawyer and a computer engineer, and he advises clients about the impact of the DMA from a competition law and a cybersecurity point of view. Kay, thanks for taking the time to speak with me about this. If I could just start off.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Paul.
Great. No, it's great to have you. If I could just kick it off, the Digital Markets Act is a preemptive regulation for the purposes of altering the competition landscape of Europe's digital economy. So can we just start by taking a look at what you think policymakers in Europe are trying to achieve with this? How, if you can get inside their heads, what is it they think they're trying to achieve with the DMA?
Yeah, certainly. And I think the framing of it as a preemptive instrument is definitely an ex ante instrument that comes in and goes after conduct before it has been shown to have any negative effect on the market. And they have this idea of the things that they want to change in the market. They want it to be structured a certain way where digital platforms are concerned. I think there are legitimate concerns globally around the size of some large tech companies, many of which are based in the US. And I think there have been legitimate concerns as well over the last years of kind of the competition law enforcement being a little bit behind on the developments of the digital economy, and maybe not having the right toolbox or having all the right theories of harm to address concerns that they might have been under enforcing a bit. I think there's some legitimacy to those concerns as well, and so in a way the DMA is meant to address what was perceived as, or still is in some ways perceived as, the inability of competition law to reach some kinds of harmful conduct. Though I would really question the latter, because we've seen in the last couple of years especially a lot of new competition enforcement cases, both at national and EU level. We've seen courts affirm infringements in the digital space and uphold challenges to those cases. So we are seeing very active competition enforcers in the digital economy. And that does lead me to query a little bit whether a broad new regulatory instrument that doesn't look at the effects, that doesn't make room for a case-by-case assessment or any objective justifications or defenses or other concerns of the impacts that some of these rules and remedies might have on companies.
I mean, certainly we've seen a change in doctrine, and it's really on both sides of the Atlantic, right? I mean, you have Lina Khan's famous paper, which was, she's the chairperson of the FTC, right? The Federal Trade Commission. And obviously you'd be aware that she has this paper where she's hearkening back to a kind of pre-Bork approach to competition, and maybe something which in some ways it's closer to how the Europeans see the world, I guess, a kind of an ordoliberalism, as I think economists call it. But it seems, I mean, I think you're right, but I guess if the doctrine is moving back towards this kind of more structural approach to competition, where they in a way that the regulation is partly designing the market or the shape of the market, you are at that point, you are jettisoning case law, aren't you?
And that's indeed why new regulation and new legislation is the solution, because it's hard to avoid effects-based assessment given the case law, the way competition law is developed. It has moved away from the treatment of a bunch of categories of conduct as per se abusive. And there has been a move over the last 20 years for a more economic assessment that considers what would competition look like in the absence of this agreement. Would it be better? What are the overall effects of this agreement, or conduct or practice? And I think that does make it more difficult to enforce if you have to provide evidence of harm. It's harder. I think there's good reasons to make it more difficult. That there's good reasons for the enforcer, the cop on the beat, so to say, to have to provide evidence of something criminal or something illegal having happened, and that having harmed people, especially when you're talking about single firm conduct, when you're talking about firms that are doing designing their products in certain ways, designing their services in certain ways that maybe rivals feel is difficult to deal with, but but consumers might be happy with.
So I mean, but I think what you're kind of slightly pointing at it is unintended consequences or possible unintended consequences. I don't know how you feel about that kind of vision, I suppose. I mean, I think Lina Khan was correct, and I think the European Commission is correct when it says, look, there is stuff that happens with platforms that people like Bork and the basic consumer harm proponents never really anticipated, and so we need to have measures to prevent those. I mean, I guess intuitively I would have sort of said, well, okay, so design rules to minimize or eliminate the worst abuses, but if you're kind of have blanket rules around who the blanket rules telling platforms they have to be open, for example, to third parties and so on, and sharing data so we can create a new market. So, and that has security implications. And can you talk a little bit about the security? I mean, I think maybe the big unintended consequence of this at the moment seems to be possible security issues. That's the obvious one. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. There's a sort of a tension between privacy, security, data protection, and competition where the digital economy is concerned. So firms that use data and data analytics to enhance their services, that access to data being spread around and everyone having access to it can potentially make it easier for companies that don't have that data to begin with, or haven't generated that data, haven't been able to collect that data. So there's provisions here that would say, well, if you're a rival search engine, you can come in and get all of the search queries, users' behavior when they're interacting with a gatekeeper search service, and you can then use all of that data, which has privacy implications. What you're searching for, what solutions you find or answers you find relevant to different queries. All this kind of data that would then be used by a rival to create a rival Google search service might be good for competition, in the sense if you think that having a duplicate to Google is good for competition, but might not be good from a privacy perspective. There's other examples of this. The GDPR, there's been studies that looked at what was the amount of entry of new apps entering the market following GDPR, and they found that app entry fell by more than 50%, and that GDPR even reduced app usage by 41% and increased development costs. That doesn't mean that's the GDPR is a bad thing. It just means that there is a tension here, and these two things need to be considered when applying a rule that is for the basis of creating more competition or creating contestability in a market. Similarly, right now, there's very much tension between publishers and large platforms, including both on the news aggregator side and on the mobile side, where it's about, the publishers want continued access to cookies so that they can target advertising. But the large platforms say, well, there's a user demand for more privacy-oriented services, and whether you're talking about warning labels for apps, privacy labels for apps, or you're talking about phasing cookies out of the advertising ecosystem. Both objectives are important objectives, but there seems to be a bit of a lack of appreciation of the privacy objective in the DMA. So the DMA is an instrument for contestability and fairness, and pursues those objectives without regard really for consumers or for privacy.
I mean, Europe certainly has a pretty robust cybersecurity privacy sort of regime, and it's quite impressive. But I think it is the case that the DMA is in a way it's like you had a separate bunch of policymakers going off down this road for openness and a kind of industrial policy for the digital economy in Europe and so on, and not quite taking into account, losing to some extent what you might call situational awareness about the fact there are other considerations. It's a very, I mean, do you just, as an aside, and I'm not sure if this is something you have paid a lot of attention to, but do you have an opinion about how realistic is it for European policymakers to expect that the DMA really is going to facilitate some development of some kind of European digital economy by treating them as carriers in a way, and demanding access to them as if they were carriers, like in the old days of telephones? Do you have a sense of how realistic that is?
I do have a lot of opinions on that. I think it's a question of what kind of rivalry are you talking about by mandating that these large successful US companies effectively become infrastructure and software as a service or application interfaces for all their rivals, then you're moving them to a different place in the value chain. You're saying, well, you need to prioritize your business users over your consumers, two-sided markets. They're very, very clear preference in the DMA for the service to business users, whether it's giving them data on what today would be considered the platform's customers. The DMA makes it very clear those aren't your customers anymore. Those are your business users' customers. You're just an infrastructure provider. And what are the implications of that going to be? I think it's a big experiment. Hasn't really been done before, in the sense of the closest analogy is the telecoms framework. And what we saw was there was a lot of competition on the service level, but not a lot of investment in the infrastructure anymore. So those kind of access conditions, while they might have promoted like the creation of more MNOs, they didn't end up creating more investment. And this is a market where we're talking about digital platforms. There is already a lot of investment, and that kind of competition for investment at the technology level, that's where the real quality is being generated. This isn't about very standardized products and services that you just want to drive costs down and make sure the companies aren't making margins, excessive margins. The companies here are innovating and creating new technologies constantly. So I think the approach will have a lot of unintended consequences alongside the security one, but from an economic side as well.
It seems to me that to some extent they are tackling symptoms, they're treating symptoms rather than doing something which itself will create fertile soil for growth. I mean, for example, Europe doesn't have a single capital market. It doesn't have very deep capital markets for startups. So if you're Jeff Bezos or somebody who could be Jeff Bezos type, and you're in Milan, and you need, you know, $3.5 billion or euro to sink into this thing, you're not going to get it on the Italian capital markets, and and there isn't really any kind of single market across Europe for capital. So, you know, it seems that one of the symptoms of that kind of way of thinking, and that's only one of the things, is that Europe tends not to, and for decades and decades now has not excelled. I mean, probably since the World War II, has not produced any kind of dominant technology. I mean, Nokia are a possible example, but really it has produced no real leader technology or technology business model that sustained itself over time. And it just seems to me very hard to think how you can make these rules in terms of treating them as carriers, and expect suddenly then Europe to produce these digital platform champions, when in fact, you know, does Europe need digital platform champions? Maybe we need other things.
I think there's a lot of things that are barriers to that growth of European sort of the natural growth of the European alternatives. One being the still somewhat fragmented single market. So in terms of the digital single market, you do have a lack of harmonization of rules, and the DMA in some ways is meant to address this by harmonizing rules on platform conduct and preventing member states from fragmenting through sort of unfair competition or antitrust fragmentation or economic dependence or just other kinds of economic regulation of platforms. So if it meets its objectives, it could help just from that perspective, depending on how much you think that the risk of all of this fragmentation was, you know, the reason why the rivals aren't coming up, and the extent to which the DMA will actually address that fragmentation. But yeah, no, I think there's a lot of other obstacles. But the European Commission's toolbox, at least, is still somewhat limited. They can't do things like create visas for highly qualified engineers, data scientists, you know, AI experts or what have you to come from abroad. That has to be done on the national level. So there's still, you know, limits to what the Commission can do, and I think they're trying to do what they can in some respects.
Have you? Sorry, this is a slightly left field question, and we didn't discuss it. But have you looked at all at the Digital Services Act, and I don't know how they would work together. I mean, the Digital Services Act, in a way, is a kind of a regulation of, I guess, it's aimed more at content regulation, and it again, I think it seems to be wanting to appoint. You know, it seems to be very much a kind of an ex ante model where each country gets a kind of super coordinator, it's called, I think, to coordinate what, you know, the online content. and I think, again, that there's an anxiety behind the DSA, which is this very macro thinking, this very kind of ex ante thinking, that Europe is in mortal danger from things like disinformation or you know, various bad actors online, and so we need all this draconian thing. It's so the DSA is quite an interesting one, I think, as well. I think to some extent, just to get it off my chest, I think the problem with the DSA is that it's probably in danger. I think that there is a danger to freedom of expression from the DSA. I think that it's kind of, at the end of the day, it seems to be a machine for institutionally aligning opinion and analysis. But that's just my own view, which is probably slightly, in US terms, I'm probably a bit of a First Amendment fundamentalist. I don't know. Have you looked at the DSA at all?
The DMA is such a broad instrument with so many impacts. It has been keeping me quite busy. I have some very talented colleagues who are working on the DSA. But I think there is that one point that you mentioned. In some ways, the logic of the DSA is to prevent illegal things from being online.
Sure.
To encourage the gatekeepers to some extent to do more gatekeeping to some extent, whereas the DMA has a different logic. It's saying you're a gatekeeper and that's a bad thing, and you need to do less gatekeeping. You need to be more open. You need to have more third parties providing access to your ecosystem. You can't take these steps against these bad actors or potential bad actors, because that's going to limit contestability, or it's going to be potentially unfair to some business users. And so there is a bit of a contradiction there between the two. But thankfully, there have been some amendments to the DMA, at least as far as security is concerned.
Yes, talk about those.
Out of our Parliamentary Council.
Please describe those and what they're doing and what the scenario is now with the DMA.
Certainly. So there are several provisions within the DMA that have an impact on security, that could potentially have these implications. You can talk about the ones where you provide access to data, and some of the sort of anti-leakage provisions or the circumvention provisions, the App Store unbundling of 61C, the 61F, which is meant to be preventing companies from leveraging strengths that they might have with their core platform service into ancillary services. But the way the 61F is actually written is basically giving broad infrastructure access to, like root level admin access. Literally the same access that you keep for yourself, a gatekeeper would keep for yourself, has to be provided to third parties, to their entire technology stack. And then, there's only one very broad exception for public security under Article 9, but query, how that would work, whether the public security is sufficiently impacted by individual sort of decisions that might be made on a service by service or business user by business user level, and Article 9 requires a whole procedure in order to get approval from the Commission. Query how seriously the Commission will take it, when right now we're in a bit of a point in the public debate where anything that a large technology company would say in defense of a practice is sort of like, oh, that's just your self-interest. You don't actually care about consumers. You don't actually care about SMEs. You're just trying to maintain your monopoly position, allegedly. But that being said, with these risks from a variety of these provisions, these obligations that will apply to gatekeepers, there are a couple of amendments to address some of these concerns. So, for example, Article 5C, Article 5A, that prevents cross-service data analytics, which is meant to kind of prevent the data advantage that companies have from using data from one service to improve their other services.
Is that practical? I mean, is that practical? Can it be implemented, do you think?
Considering the level of fines that could be imposed without needing to show any harm, if you put it into law and you enforce it, it can be done, certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be difficult, and if you don't have enough time to do it, it could mean you have to shut the service off until you've sorted it out. It could make some services unprofitable potentially. I don't think 5A necessarily makes services unprofitable, but some of these obligations where you have to give free access to something to your rivals could certainly make some services unprofitable. But from a security perspective, what 5A does is it prevents one of the most prevalent methods of threat detection, which is to take data points from across different services and combine them to sort of create a early warning system that you wouldn't be able to catch these kind of bad guys as quickly as you would if you were having to rely on siloed data analysis. And thankfully, the council has put in amendment to that would allow Gatekeeper to use more justifications. Would create some possibility, not just consent of the user, because of course a bad guy is not going to give consent to that kind of data processing. Sure. So rather than having to rely solely on consent where there's a security implication, a designated gatekeeper could potentially still do that kind of cross-service data analytics. So that's one example. I've got a couple more if you're interested as well.
Just give us one or two more, and then I'll ask you a final question.
So another one is this kind of risk of malware, of fraud, which comes from diversion to less reliable, less safe channels. You could be talking about an app store or a marketplace or anything. I mean, there's anti circumvention and I mean, we know just a few weeks ago Microsoft identified evidence of a malware operation targeting the Ukraine and attributing it to Russia. So people trying to get malware installed on devices of sensitive people, and that kind of, it's a combination, right? It's in a perfect world you would say, oh well, I have an app. I shouldn't be forced to make my customers go through the app store. They should be able to download my app directly. Sure, from a contestability perspective, that might make some sense. But when you apply that as a general rule to every external app, that then you make saying to the gatekeeper, you can't gatekeep against these potentially dangerous apps or malware or fraud, merchants who might have their accounts hacked, and a hacker who then has control over a merchant account then tries to get users to go make transactions off platform and enter their financial details, where there is no recourse to our warranty policy or our return policy or our any policy, because it's not on the platform anymore. It's off the platform. Customer is going to blame the platform or just have a negative experience and not feel safe online anymore. And that kind of what you mentioned earlier, this aggregators, these gatekeepers create safe environments online where customers, users feel confident to make transactions.
This is something to which you've alluded. Sorry, you've actually mentioned, you've pointed to this before, and if I can try and summarize it, you see a potential fragmentation of the user experience. That when you shop on a large platform like Amazon, that you have come back on Amazon if something's not right, and Amazon will invariably stand behind whatever they're doing. Whereas if the whole thing gets fragmented, you're potentially in a kind of a Wild West where the consumer has to take a lot more effort to ensure that he or she is getting value.
And ultimately that's to the benefit of the big recognizable suppliers, business users of those platforms. I'm not going to go and shop on some company's, Amazon page that I've never heard of if I don't have the same recourse that Amazon provides. I know when Amazon is backing up that merchant, I feel confident and comfortable. Similarly with Apple's App Store, I know Apple's going to back me up. I'm not going to get hijacked as a result of one of these apps, and they're not going to impose a billing on me that I haven't agreed to. And if some sort of thing happens there, I do have recourse to Apple. I don't have to rely on this potential fly-by-night fraudster to give me my to remedy, and that will be limited by the DMA, that potentially quite a bit. And so, yeah, I mean, for example, with this App Store question, there is this amendment. Both Parliament and Council actually have tried to address this slightly different ways, but basically in 6.1c, Article 6.1c of the DMA, they would allow the companies, the gatekeepers, say, to empower users to make security choices and not just treat necessarily, like you said, putting them into a Wild West out there, that the gatekeeper can still do some of that gatekeeping function.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think they probably want to do that. I had a final question, which I mean is a general question. Are you? I mean, how optimistic are you that that the DMA will do what it intends to do, will do what it's meant to do? I mean, do you have any? If you were a betting man, how effective is it going to be?
I think ultimately, I mean, it depends on what you perceive as what the intention is behind the DMA. The DMA itself doesn't look at the effects. It's a piece of legislation. Ultimately, it has to be enforced. The commission, woefully understaffed with 80 people to enforce it. That's not going to lead to the most robust decision making. I think they definitely need more resources there. But assuming they have enough resources, they will be the ones who will ultimately have to take into account how these rules are going to be applied. And if the law itself has all these negative effects that could happen because of the way it's applied, consumers will know why
it becomes law.
Services is degraded in Europe.
I presume when it passes, it becomes law throughout the EU immediately. So it's not a directive. It's an act. It's a law, right? So that's going to be interesting to see how it pans out in each different country. How that's going to work. So are people going to be taking cases, under the DMA? I mean, are they going to be taking it to their local courts in their own country, or are they going to be taking it to the commission?
I think that kind of remains to be seen what the final text will say. Right. I think there are really a good chance that it could be enforced at the local national court level, which is kind of worrying because you're then potentially increasing fragmentation. You're potentially having not just a divergence, but also maybe some decisions being taken that aren't going to take into account the wider repercussions of some of these obligations.
And you're possibly
empowering you are right.
Yeah, you may be empowering local politicization or national politicization of the law, depending. Although I guess it's meant to avoid that, and it probably should avoid a lot of that, because right
it's
now,
supposed to, but there's still the language that's currently being contemplated doesn't fully do that. And yes, you are right to say that this would be the law right away, and companies generally need to sort of engage with the commission to make sure that their compliance is going to be acceptable, at least for the Article 6 obligations. I think it's helpful that there are some provisions for regulatory dialogue. I think those can be improved, and if the lawmakers and the negotiators take steps in a direction less of sort of, we want to punish these companies, but let's try to make the DMA actually work. They'll try to make these dialogues more robust. so that these unintended consequences will be minimized, hopefully. I have to be optimistic. You know, I'm a tech enthusiast. I work for the technology industry. I know Europe wants to have a growing and successful entrepreneurial, innovation-driven, dynamic digital economy, and so I have to believe that those kind of protectionist elements or the kind of the retribution that some feel like they seek or need to seek against the big U.S. tech companies will be tempered in the implementation.
Great. Okay, that's fantastic. Kay, that's fantastic. It's all we have time for, unfortunately. So I want to thank Kay Jebelli of the CCIA, and thanks for taking your time to take us through this important